It's really great to have you all here. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining our very first Tetley Artist Conversation online. I'm Bryony Bond, I'm the director at the Tetley, and I'm very excited to be introducing this evening's event and our two fantastic speakers this evening. Before I start, I wanted to just thank you all for joining us this evening. It's great to have so many people with us this evening from across the UK and internationally, very excitingly. You're all here to kind of take part in the conversation, so we really welcome any comments that you might have. So please add them to the comments screen on YouTube, or you can also send any questions via our Instagram. And my fantastic colleague, Georgia Taylor Aguilar, will be able to facilitate those, and we'll go through those at the end. I'd also like to take this opportunity to really thank you all for donations that you've made for this in conversation. Past few months have been obviously very challenging for us at the Tetley, as for many organisations and for individuals. And the continued support of individuals and the Arts Council really makes it possible to continue and able to do conversations like this. So thank you for your continued support. So my job this evening is to really introduce our two speakers. And I'm going to start with Emii Alrai. So I first got to know Emii's work actually through her graduate show at the University of Leeds in 2016, when I was invited to be one of the judges of the FUAM Graduate Art Prize, which was awarded to Emii. So that was a really great way to get to know Emii's work. And since then, we've had the pleasure of working with Emii through our Tetley Associate Artist Programme and really watching careers, Emii's career flourish over the last few years. So she's had exhibitions at GLOAM in Sheffield, at Two Queens in Leicester, and VITRINE in London. And she has an exhibition forthcoming next year at Jerwood Space, a solo presentation, which will happen in February next year. Emii's exhibition, The High Dam, at the Tetley, opened in February this year and was due to close at the end of this month, but unfortunately we have closed due to COVID. I hope you all got a chance to see it in real life, but if you missed it, you can see the exhibition on our 3D virtual tour, which the link is in the comments and description below. Emii this evening is joined in conversation by the eminent Griselda Pollock. We're delighted to have Griselda with us this evening. Griselda's commitment to extending an international, post-colonial, queer, feminist analysis of the visual arts, visual culture, and cultural theory is unparalleled. During her career, she's published many books, which I've been instructed to only inform you of one this evening, and that would be Charlotte Salomon's Theatre and the Theatre of Memory, which we urge you to read. But also, I'd just like to mention that Old Mistresses has also been republished, and there's a fantastic talk on 5 Leaves bookshop website where you can see Griselda talking about that. Earlier this year, Griselda's work was recognised by the Holberg Prize, and they described her as the foremost feminist art historian working today. And we're delighted that Griselda's here this evening. She's been a long-term supporter of the Tetley and actually joined our board of trustees earlier this year. And we're delighted to have formed a partnership to create an artist network in the crisis, which I'll talk more about at the end of this conversation. But for now, I'm delighted to hand over to Emii and to Griselda to take this conversation forward. I'm very much looking forward to listening to it myself. And thank you so much for being here. So Griselda and Emii, over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Bryony. I'm absolutely thrilled to have been invited to do this because Emii is such an exceptional artist and somebody that I have had the pleasure of watching, as it were, from the point at which I first encountered her work as a final year student in fine art, and I was invited to a crit, and I saw this extraordinary piece of work. We had a very long conversation about it, and so I have watched what was quite clear at that time, you always know that there's definitely an artist in your company at a certain point. And I'm always astonished. It's been one of my enormous privileges all my life as a professional to work at the University of Leeds and to work in a fine art department and watch the process by which you wander through the studios and you look at the work that's coming, and then suddenly you see something and think, where did that come from? And, it just is that moment of transformation of something's taken to another leap. And so watching with incredible pride and pleasure Emii win the FUAM Prize and then go on to produce a series of extraordinary exhibitions, each one more complex, more fascinating, more researched and more demanding of our kind of real work to work with it and understand it. So when I was offered the opportunity to talk to Emii and to be in conversation with her, I leapt at it as a delight to feel that we're going to look at this very, very important exhibition that she's installed at the Tetley, which I think is entirely suitable because it's back in Leeds. It's Leeds where we're trying to help make through the Tetley the sort of the space for world-class artists, such as are regularly shown in Tetley, but artists at the point at which they are emerging into visibility, not emerging as artists. They are all very remarkable artists. So what I wanted to do to start off with them is not only congratulate you on the show and how delighted it is at the Tetley of all places and that we've had this chance, but maybe just to ask you to just talk about this particular piece. We'll come back to it in a little bit more detail, I think, a bit later. But just if you could, introduce everybody to what are the issues that are central to your work in terms of this project. How is this project specifically evolved for the Tetley?
Thanks, Griselda. I feel like that's like really unbelievably lovely of you to say all that stuff. And yeah, do you know what I mean? It's also just like a great pleasure and privilege for me to be in conversation with you as well this evening. And thanks everybody for coming along. But yeah, I guess for the High Dam, I kind of started developing these like the kind of main themes that I think kind of there's kind of two that are like integral to my practice, and one of them is kind of this exploration of the way in which Western museums have collected since the 18th century like artifacts from the Middle East, and how they display them and how these objects then kind of form the architecture of the museums that we go and visit to today. So for example, places like the British Museum, the Pergamon, the Louvre in Paris. And how we start to like read and understand these objects through that lens of the Western Museum, and what it actually means to have those objects on display, and how we then kind of read those histories and how that kind of helps inform identity. So I guess one of my main like interests with that is specifically looking at the methods of display, so armature and spacing within like the museum, and why they specifically choose to display things on armatures, or how a lot of objects actually like end up in their store collections and maybe not actually so visible to the public. And then I guess the other strand of like my practice that kind of intertwines with that is a kind of investigation of identity, and kind of thinking about my own experience of that, and growing up in an Iraqi family and also in Scotland at the same time. And I guess kind of the navigation of like that diaspora community, thinking about what it is that actually like identifies me as being Iraqi and what doesn't. And that kind of, I guess, interest and this kind of, I guess like an interest in like that history and how that kind of becomes part of like who I am, despite the fact never actually like visiting Iraq. But because growing up in my family, which are very tight-knit Iraqi community, kind of being inherited or like inheriting these histories and these stories and these like mannerisms or language or phrases that then kind of become so integral to like my identity as somebody who is British Iraqi or British. And I guess kind of mixing that with this investigation of the Western museum structure and into artifacts specifically, and I guess kind of a kind of wider excavation of like, what does it mean? What do objects mean, and are they so, and why are they so important to us? Like, in terms of being able to carve out this identity and place us within this longer form, like generational history.
Thank you so much. That's really kind of gives us a very nice kind of complex, broad picture while we're looking at the specific elements there. I wanted just to pick up a couple of things there that really sort of rang a bell with me. One side of it is that kind of attention to this structure, as you say, these armatures, these methods of display. And I want to share with you something that's interested me for many years. I wrote a paper once about the fact that, you know, the Cycladic, the dolls, these what they call dolls, these little tiny sculptures from the Cycladic Islands, which became so influential on early 20th century art, particularly on Brancusi and other artists who saw this radical simplicity. Even though they clearly have no means of standing up and are carved so they should lie down, you always see them sort of, you know, held up with these kind of metal grips and these great spines of metal when they're as if they're standing creatures, because, you know, but they're not. They're obviously grave goods. They're obviously associated with, you know, the vertical, the horizontal and death rather than, and that's why they've got masks on and they're looking up to heaven. So they're obviously burial goods. But of course, archaeologists were influenced by, you know, their own culture's version of what they thought the past should be. So they always make them stand up and they sort of teeter on these strange feet. So I have a little, a model of one, which I lay out on stones on my bookshelf to make sure that, you know, it's on that. So I was very interested by that sense of a kind of, what you're saying about the museum display as selecting and then, you know, actually almost forcing things that once had a different relationship, often to the earth and often to burial, which is why they survived, are made into figures in very much in a kind of Greek Western logic. So it seems to me even just paying attention to that kind of form of display that isolates precious objects or forces them to be standing or props them up. While what you've done in your work is, particularly in the High Dam, you cluster objects, which are more the way that we find them in grave goods and in archaeology. So there's a kind of image of this in the museum and display, but then there's the other world from which these come, because if they're uncovered or discovered, they've often been buried, whether they were burial goods or they've been buried by time. So there's this issue of excavation. And I wonder if you could talk about this sense as a sculptor, how the logic of sort of Western museum display and the sort of the originating home of where these relics of the past have been found, is that something that plays over in your mind as you make this work? That you're speaking in one sense back to modern museological violence that represents the extraction and sort of aestheticization of things, and on the other hand, this sense of what are these objects, the way that you present them, they have a different presence, which is not, and often in the sense we'll see in the inside of the High Dam, these whole series of communities almost. I wonder if that rings any bells with you as you make the work, or think about it when you see it, when you've actually installed it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like definitely. I mean, like the High Dam itself was like based on like an object that was seen at Birmingham Museums and Galleries, and it's a really small scale bitumen boat, which is what the boat is then like, essentially like a large scale version of that I kind of wanted to create. And like the specific boat was, you know, found in a gravesite in the ancient Middle East, in like an Assyrian grave site, and it was found like in the burial chambers of the past. There were like two shafts, so there'd be like the one shaft where a person would be laid to rest, and then there'd be like a secondary shaft where like these kind of objects, which are called tutelary, like these kind of tutelic forms that are there to protect the body from grave robbers or from evil spirits. But this specific boat, which is completely formed out of bitumen, it's just, that was like a raw material that was used at the time. And it's like a really strange example of, not strange, like I think it's really beautiful and amazing, but there's not very many of them that have been found and like preserved. And there's maybe three, one which is in London, which was in Birmingham, and I think the other one's like somewhere in Switzerland or somewhere like in Europe, which is kind of wild. But the kind of research around those boats was about they think that they were like essentially there as like demon like lures, or like this kind of passage, this vessel that would either like carry the person who passed away into the next life or the next stage, or that would be like a deterrent, or this kind of, yeah, I guess a warning for people who were coming in to like take things from graves or pillaging. And I found it really interesting, like seeing that object in the museum in Birmingham, because it's just in this vitrine that says, you know, ancient Iraq, and it's very small, and there's all these kind of clustered objects, and it kind of becomes this really unassuming object. It kind of loses its sense of, you know, what was that when you kind of first experienced that, like in that gravesite? Should we have ever taken that out? Should we have ever like moved that? And what happens to it? Has it essentially like gone from one graveyard to another in many senses by like entering the museum? And I guess like I was quite interested in this idea of like the vessel as well, and like how, yeah, I guess in museums, how all of these like little forms are always, as you say, kind of pushed up, and you're always faced with them at eye contact level, and you're kind of getting this history that it's almost like this is how you should look at this object, where it doesn't actually have like the actual history that it was buried with, or any of that kind of oral history that might have still been lingering with like the people who were helping excavate those sites, or people from that geography that was never collected at the time. And I think I'm really interested in the way that we take these objects out of, or like archaeologists have taken these objects out of those contexts and out of those geographies. And I guess how they've been written about, where we don't actually know what we're talking about half the time with these objects. Like maybe we have this very like scientific approach of like, yes, this was a vessel and this did this, but actually we don't know any further in many senses. And it's interesting that then we kind of grow up with this history of, yes, this is like, you know, this was what the, like a canopic jar was used for, but we don't have kind of that like further imagery. Or I guess also kind of thinking about if somebody from that time period came to visit this museum, like would they laugh themselves dry because they would just see this thing that was, you know, maybe it was just a vessel, maybe it was like a vase in their houses, as we have like decorative objects in our homes? Or is it, you know, how do we like essentially take those objects out and like place value onto them? And I guess like with the High Dam and this idea of like clustering objects, I kind of wanted to, I guess, play with this idea of like this vessel and kind of almost like this like large grave, which the boat kind of acts as, and like having all these different objects which are kind of lifted from different collections or different histories or different books or research that I've been doing, and kind of manipulated through like the making process, and how actually like there's such this mishmash of different cultures, or not different cultures. Most of the work that I kind of look to and develop or like use as inspirations is from the ancient Middle East, but obviously there is lots of different peoples living at that time. But yeah, I guess like that my interest of like putting all these things together to maybe question like what is it that we draw out of these, and how do we like visually like link them together, even though they might not be together in any sense or form. And yeah, with some of the works I've like written in Arabic, which is like I speak it fluently, but I've been illiterate in it since I was, you know, as a child, and like trying to relearn this language now, and I guess trying to like translate these like stories that have been passed down to me by my family, and that have been, you know, passed down by generations from their families, like onto these objects, and like how putting those words or that kind of script onto these objects, like almost I kind of feel like to audiences who might not read Arabic or understand what it is that's written in that, like almost elevates these objects as these kind of orientalized or like, you know, exotic objects that, you know, might have this higher power. But, you know, actually I remember my mum coming to see it and being like, that makes no sense, like it's like grammatically incorrect, it's very childish, it's very doesn't really like make sense. But it's this idea of like that playing with how people perceive things and what we place as valuable. And I guess also, again, similarly with like the materials that I use as well, like instead of using like these authentic materials such as like ceramics that would then be fired, using like air dry clay or using plaster or using copper leaf and then oxidizing that and covering plaster forms to make them look like they're these authentic artifacts, which, you know, I'm interested in that kind of theatricality of how at first glance they could be these, you know, bronze objects, but actually they're not. They're made out of very like, you know, very like basic materials in some senses, and actually like maybe aren't so valuable. And yeah, I guess kind of putting them all together, kind of wanted to play with this idea of trickery or questioning like that identity of those specific objects themselves.
Thank you. That's lovely. It raises, again, a number of different questions. One I do want to come back to, which is materiality. It seems to me that was from the very beginning when I first met your work, that sense of how specific materials can set off, you know, senses and aesthetic associations that sort of already say an enormous amount, already tip you towards the kind of area that you're in. But we'll just hold that for 1 second, because I want to come back to this whole issue, which is the deeper one that you're talking about in terms of, obviously you say the Middle East. Okay, so in terms of the peoples who live in what was Babylonia and Assyria, and these they were the center of the universe, and obviously the origins of human culture, as far as we know, in you know, obviously origins of human people and their cultures are on the African continent, with a city that's 40,000 years old in Zimbabwe City, one of the oldest sort of multiple constructions. And obviously people were very, very sophisticated, even amongst the people who first moved into Europe. But we all sort of think about Assyria, Babylon, which is, you know, now Iraq, you know, Iran and you know, Lebanon, you know, all these countries that have, I mean, I know from, since the Jewish Bible, these are the great powers. And then, you know, Egypt is in North Africa, and then the great powers, so that they're not in the east of anywhere, right? Then even the notion of the Middle East means that somebody's taking their center point from Europe and saying, you're to the east and you're to the west. But of course, this was the center, and these are these amazing cultures that are sophisticated and imperial and you know, creative in all sorts of ways. And what we've got is, in a sense, what the earth will preserve. You know, so there's that sense of what people excavate, but also the things that people went to such trouble to preserve their dead. And then we come and everybody comes and digs them up and takes the grave goods away, and as you say, dismisses any sense of respect for this most extraordinary thing that people have to deal with, is what you do with death. Human beings are human, and then suddenly they're no more, but we don't cast them away onto the, you know, the garbage heap. We have these amazing rituals about this, which means that it's so deep. What is the question of human time? And it seems to me that what you're touching on that work is in a sense the violence of the colonial imagination, and the sort of violence of those who see only the traces of civilizations. And then, you know, you say the whole thing of musealizing a past, as opposed to what I think you're saying about there's a continuity, because people still live on. People have obviously undergone transformation through the arrival of Islam, and, you know, overlaying the original religions and the original power systems. But I think this is such a crucial thing. It's when you then come back to your sense of identity, because if you're offered, as so many peoples of the world are offered when they come to Europe, only the traces of the sort of the deadness of the culture, drawn from this mishandling of the rituals of respect for the two moments of human life and human death. You yourself are kind of as if you're a relic. You come from Iraq, which was, you know, as far as I know, Babylonia and Assyria. You have one of the, you know, longest histories of the world, and one that's implanted in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim texts and their histories, and yet you're going to feel separated, and then you just encounter traces. So I'm just interested in maybe talking a little bit more about, in a sense, what you introduced, this idea of diasporic identity, of in what sense are you, in a sense, both mourning for not just separation, but from a sense of continuity, but it's not continuity, it's broken continuity. There's a new world. Iraq is a new world, and obviously you're here for reasons that you're not in Iraq, right? And yet, as you say, who are you? How do you build yourself around it? So you've mentioned notions of community, you've mentioned notions of stories and continuity, you've mentioned notions of language, but you're also, I think that's partly why these your works do not feel like imitations of museum shows. You endowed them with a kind of presence which seems to me to come from the sculptural imagination that you bring to the display. And you talked about armatures, but there's something very special about space and the decisions you make, what you've talked about also with this materials that have, from a distance, make you think you're looking at encrusted bronze or all these different kinds of things where chemical processes have happened and stone has disintegrated. But what you call your fakery isn't negative. It isn't fake. It's actually sculptural. It depends upon this capacity to make things that give the feel of other things. So I wonder if we'll come to the boat in a minute in its fullness, but I just wonder, when you go around this exhibition, does it give you a feeling that you've kind of reconnected, or that you are trying to, in a sense, use color, use texture, all the kind of research you must have done to get these effects, that these effects then are not imitations of decayed objects, but are the very poignant affect of a sense of loss and reconnection? I mean, that's one of the things I feel about the work, that you're holding a very, not just a sort of, here they're dead in the museum, but there's something very vivid, emotionally, aesthetically, about these objects, that you've kind of re-enchanted them in some way. I don't know, does that ring any bells with you in terms of the feeling you want us to sort of have when we encounter your work?
Yeah, I guess so. Like, I think that there's definitely like this, I think for me, like, because when I kind of start researching to make works, like it's such like book heavy or like research heavy beginning, where it's like I'm looking at all these objects and kind of reading about them, and then kind of going back to my family and like asking about them, or asking about these images that I might have seen in a book, or this word, or this kind of context, and like from that kind of like unravels these other histories that might have been, we haven't spoken about for a really long time, or like they've kind of forgotten because, like our memories aren't as linear as, we can't extract like every single memory that we want and pass that on. It's I think object really like sparks that, and kind of bringing it through those histories that I think like often can become lost. And I find that really like, I guess with my kind of connection with my family and like their history, and like my family who used to live in Iraq, that history as well. And I guess that kind of communication has been like a really like amazing one, where I think I've learned so much more about my culture and the culture that my family lived through, and is their culture more so than mine, because I'm, this kind of product where I'm like, or a person who I'm, kind of split in and have this dual sense of an identity. Yeah, I think it kind of trying to bring that history back into like objects, and I guess in some way trying to narrate this idea that how do I put this, like, yeah, I guess like narrating these stories like into these objects. Like some of them, like I remember getting told the story about a horse that was set free, and then like it was part of like my great granddad's farm in the village, and they set it free. They didn't want it anymore, and the horse kept running back and running back and kept running back, and it became this almost like, I don't know, I think maybe also within like Iraqi and Arabic, specifically maybe Iraqi, it's like there's this kind of really storytelling kind of way of like like remembering and this almost lamentation of language and history that then I think as it's kind of handed to me, and then I kind of think about what do I do with this history? Like, who do I pass that on to? Like now starting as like first generation in this country, like who then will inherit that, and how do I like, I guess, like immortalize it in a sense, or like try to place it in these objects where it kind of lives on in its own sense. But yeah, I mean, I guess like within like texture and trying to visualize like a place and emotion and an identity that feels very much like it courses through like my flesh and my blood and my language and my voice and whatever, but then also a place that you've never visited. It's like such a strange severing. And I'm really interested in that moment of like, especially like when you think about that in terms of like museums as well. So thinking about like when the Pergamon took the Ishtar Gate from the excavation site at Ur. And it's like, when they removed those objects, like what is that residue that remains? Like what happens at that space of like a cultural collision, like when those objects are taken because they're things of beauty, and then what is actually left, and then how do you then glean an identity from that residue? And I guess that sense of residue is something that I kind of want to explore within the sculptural work. And I guess kind of linking like that imagery, like especially with like the use of plaster and like using the walls as like a way of coating the gallery walls, like I guess kind of drawing from these kind of traditional methods of using plaster, which like my dad's family were all builders, and they used to build these amazing mosques in Iraq, and then also like do a lot of like the plaster carving. So kind of trying to learn these traditional skills that have been generational and have, you know, still use these kind of methods that are maybe like archaic in some senses, aren't, also because they still do the job, but, you know, trying to like rope that into like a way of making again. So using those kind of plaster formulas, then thinking about the way that the West has always portrayed like that place that I'm from to me without me having like delved into my history. So when I was a kid watching like the war in Iraq with my parents on the television, and you know, in 2003, and watching them watch their homes be destroyed, but then that kind of residue, that kind of, you know, demolition, that these spaces, these monuments, these people's homes that are ruined, and it's unbelievably tragic and awful, and there's so many like, it's still, you know, it's still happening now, and it's terrible, but it's that thing. It's like that's what we then think about when we think about the Middle East. We like associate specific materials to it, and then we see that like replicated in like Call of Duty or like these kind of games, and or these programs where, you know, they go to the Middle East and it's a war site and it's like these plastered walls and or this kind of gypsum that's kind of crumbling. And I find that really interesting because it's not the Iraq that I've inherited through my family and that they've kind of spoken about and that I've seen in photographs. And I guess that kind of interest in, I guess, these kind of like, I guess, moments of these collisions where it's like there's two sides to each story in a sense, if that makes any sense. I don't know if that answered your question at all, Griselda.
Yeah, I think it's taken it in a very good direction because it's brought us back in a sense to exactly the sort of the sort of the media, the Western media representation of Iraq and what it is that name evokes because of the history. And again, your sculptural work, you know, you're making that link which comes through both what you say in terms of your father and his family tradition as makers and builders, and then this question of destruction, because I think this is a kind of crucial other side, because it's the hidden. We don't see the burials, we don't see the destruction, we don't see that in the same sort of literally visceral embodied way as someone who says that's, you know, that's a street I knew, that's a village I knew, that's the kind of place I lived in, and all the rest of it. And I thought what you said about the sense that this passes through your body. And I think this is a very crucial thing for migratory experience in general, and what you talked about, diasporic experience, where, I mean, you speak with a Scottish accent, obviously, you know, that's what's very fascinating about what happens to us. Why don't we speak the way our parents speak? How do we adapt to the speech around us, coming from different communities also, where you can tell the parents and the grandparents, because they speak an accented English, and then the children integrate. But then how do you hold on to this sense that what I call the generational streak that we are, artists are caught in the sort of a double axis. One is history, where you come from, where your parents come from, where your grandparents come from, some sense of family history, and even national or ethnic or religious history, and then where you are actually placed geographically, so Scotland, Leeds, there's a sort of very complicated intersection, it seems to me, that your work is capturing. But as it were, I was very struck by your saying that the materials and the stories and the sense of being dislocated runs through your body. And that's why I think it's so interesting about being a sculptor. Obviously, the reference you say to an association with building, with those kinds of materials associated with your father and his family's skills and profession. But then you are having to fabricate them. You are, as it were, that's what it seems about, you're not painting it, you are literally making things. And the hours it took to make the walls in the Tetley, to make the Tetley turn into something like the sort of both war damaged and time damaged interior of a tomb or a discovered, building. I think that seems to me. So can we pick up again on the materials? You've touched on it a certain amount, because you've done an enormous amount of making to produce this exhibition. And I noticed the same in all the other exhibitions of yours that I've looked at. There's the overall sense of the structure, like the vitrine or certain installations that are going to try to remind us that you're in some kind of temple or monument or palace of some kind. But there's an enormous amount of making with materials that themselves already feel sort of between coming into form, and then they represent something that has lost its own contours through time or aging. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your working process and what that actually feels like for you. So, because we've got a lot of research, a very strong sense of what is the urgency to engage with this question of the past. But what is it that gives you the satisfaction and pleasure when you make the works, and then you make the installations when the works are talking to each other?
Well, it's always very tiring, very messy, as I feel the Tetley. I mean, like, I've made the boat and most of the work in the Shirley Cooper Gallery in the basement, and it's incredibly like physical, very like, yeah, just there's no way of like escaping from that like chaotic mess of like plaster, especially when you're not like actually plastering a wall and kind of doing it on cardboard. I don't know, I guess like for me, like my kind of interest in like material and that kind of exploration really started from an interest in like theatre building and set building, and kind of being interested in that theatrical element of display, and like how theatres use materials like polystyrene to carve and like hew these like stones or fireplaces or woods or whatever it is, and bring that to life on the stage. So by activating those sets, which are like painstakingly made, but they're always kind of shit. Like they're always kind of, they're made out of polystyrene. It's a material that isn't, they're not, they're not long lasting, and they kind of crumble away. And, once you kind of look at it like properly, like outside of these different activations, such as having actors or having lights or music or whatever, like they just look so fake. And I'm really interested in that relationship. And I kind of wanted to like, I think for me, like the kind of making things on such a large scale, it makes sense to use those materials like polystyrene because it's lightweight, but you can really make it look like it's dense, like it's rock, like it's, it has this like weight to it, and you can age it. And I find that really fascinating. I mean, with the photograph that's on the screen at the moment, like some of those works I made for my show, House of Teeming Cattle at Two Queens, And I'm really interested in the sense of, and this kind of long, the kind of large kind of stones that are on display at the moment, those were actually from my degree show, and they've been in every exhibition that I've exhibited in since graduating. And I'm interested in this idea of like reuse as well, and like reusing these objects for one of the reasons for ease and not making them again, and for storage as well. But I'm also interested in like the journey that those objects go through. So with this, you can see where like the polystyrene has flaked and cracked off, or where there's these like, I guess, fissures that occur within that material. And I find that really interesting because it kind of adds more to that history and that narrative of those objects as well, and how they can be reinterpreted in a space. And yeah, I guess like the different connotations you can give to them, despite the fact them being exactly the same objects that were used for previous works. I don't know, I guess like I really enjoy the physical aspect of making work as well. There's something that feels satisfying about, yeah, I guess that kind of exertion of, you know, being on your hands and knees and like swiping plaster over cardboard, and the kind of collection of these objects that are throwaway, like, you know, detritus that is cardboard, or yeah, like hops or things that I find in skips or whatever, and kind of bringing that into the studio and then being able to work into that. And then I guess using these kind of very classical building materials, you know, plaster, sand, clay, and using those to kind of create this other narrative, like because of the materiality itself. And I guess I'm kind of interested in the sort of build-up of civilization as well. Like in my show at Two Queens, I was really interested in the structures of the scaffold and how that's still something that's replicated, and we see that every day in building sites and construction sites, but is actually still the same form that was used to build the pyramids, or to build you know, like the spiral tower at Ur. And it's like it's just really interesting how history kind of repeats itself through these structures. And yeah, I guess like through clay making as well, like I think there's something that feels so satisfying, and almost like this exploration of like, because clay has such like a memory in so many senses, like if you press it, like that press will continuously like reappear within the work that you make, no matter how much you try to change it. And I find that really interesting, thinking about that material in relation to, I guess, like a history or an identity, or how you can't really move that away from your own self, and how that kind of can be replicated through clay. And also just that, you know, clay and plaster, you know, plaster is just like powdered stone. And I find it so interesting that you can reconstitute that through water and then kind of create almost these kind of fake stones, or we line it in our buildings. It's in so many structures that we encounter. And the same with clay, like clay's been around for ever, and it's still so used and has survived that long, and it's just mud. And I find that like that kind of relationship to like landscape, and that kind of taking those materials out of that landscape and then reinterpreting them, like I guess in the studio, or in terms of remaking these works that relate, or kind of think back to these histories or these specific locations, and modeling them. Yeah, I guess it's kind of satisfying. And I really like making things go green in the studio with like different patinates, and using copper leaf or like copper powder, and kind of working out the ratios of like how to make something oxidize or have this like thick patina verdigris. And yeah, with bitumen as well, like the history of bitumen, and specifically like how that's used now, and the smell of it, and the color and the texture, and how it feels like, you know, really like prehistoric, and that has all these different connotations. They all seem to kind of come together in a weird way. I don't really know if they do, but in my head.
Yeah, I love what you just said about these absolutely sort of foundational sort of elements, mud and stone, you know, and bitumen and stuff. And they are the sense, as you say, the history of civilization, which is to use materials to do something with it. And yet, you know, so you use those same things to become something, and yet you're dealing with something which is sort of presented kind of as a bit of as this relic, that there's something that's been unearthed again and given this sort of strange, pristine, sort of aestheticized life in the museum. So I'd like to take it from that sort of really discussion about your making, because I just remember coming to see the Tetley when you were actually the artist in residence, and noticing that there you were in some little kind of strange adapted office with its wood, but that was such a mess. There was so much, plaster dust, excuse me, one moment, on the floor. And I just thought, those sort of, certain kinds of studios, and trying to do this in the Tetley, excuse me, raises some sort of interesting questions about the installation. So I'd just like to come back to the actual installation as we've been seeing it, because one of the key things you mentioned at the beginning was not just this armature, and now we've really talked about the kind of incredible dense histories and meaning of the materials you use and the way that you make things. But then you make, these installed, as you say, semi-theatrical sort of reincarnations of the kind of installation. But what's so crucial about the boat is the eye line, right? Because as you I'm not a very tall person, so I was kind of obviously different people kind of look down on it or look into it, or etc. And then you said that these kind of boats were sort of buried almost sort of halfway down the grave shafts as a kind of a barrier or protection, or in one of the different shafts to sort of distract people from, or demons, or, as you say, grave robbers, real demons and real people as grave robbers, from desecrating the resting place of people in their death. But I thought in terms of sculptural space, the fact, and the one that we're looking at the moment, that's attached to its mount, but it's sort of suspended in space. And then you've got almost like birds' feet. I mean, because you've got to have tripods underneath your supports for the boat, that creates a sort of another kind of set of legs and things. But I was very interested in your eye line, wherever you put things in the eye line, which always obviously in sculpture involve the body of the viewer in a particular, height and size. And the fact that you've put the boat where you've put it seems to me a particularly structured, because then there is a sense that as I look into it, certainly from my height, I'm peering into a space, and then there's this cluster of objects that were either thrown in, or, let's say if it were a grave, thrown in or found themselves there, each one having a meaning, whether they were in daily use or they were in ritual use, or they're remnants of the person's activity, or all those kinds of things. Or we know from the most ancient studies of Neolithic sculpture that we find 3,000, 4,000 years before the Common Era, that they're all also associated with bodies. And the most important body to be evoked when you deal with death is the female body, with the pregnant body, with the body that gave life, and the earth becomes the body that receives us back. So there's a kind of interesting gender aspect to it, but this idea of the boat, which for a relatively landlocked mass of these, so we've obviously got the great rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris are the rivers of this, so that I was very struck by the sort of elemental issues of earth, both, earth, water, you said clay, stone, dust, mud, and now you mold something that can be molded and take a shape, which is a container for other containers. And I wondered if you've ever sort of thought a bit more about, in some sense, the sort of the deeper mythic associations involved in both excavation and grave robbing as violations of what should be the return to the earth, the return to the mother. And then your kind of work in terms of making so many objects which are containers of theatricality. Yes, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that this is then presented in, as I say, this kind of theatrical way. It's staged, very carefully staged, very carefully lit. And that's why I was saying about this thing about the eye line and the sort of looking in, that is so sculptural, but within a whole context that displays these objects. But I do feel at the heart of something, not only just your identity and this long history, but these are quite mythic forms that you are working with.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm really interested in mythology, like, massively. I think I'm really interested in, like, the forms of that, and I guess how much that, like, was a space for people to understand the world. And I'm really interested in kind of like the kind of old tales. Like, I'm interested in like Gilgamesh and, you know, these kind of really like amazing, I guess like ancestors or myths or these creatures that then really like, I guess like developed like an understanding of the world and like how people interacted with that. And I find that just really amazing how that differs like all over the world as well. I guess like in terms of kind of going back to what you were saying about like eyeline, I was really interested in the way that museums specifically like do put works on armatures and why they choose to kind of display them at that height. I mean, I went to the V&A, I think it was like 2 years ago now, and I was like shook because I was like, it's just like the wildest place I've been. And there, you know, there's all these like huge like facades of, you know, church exteriors that are on, you know, these armatures, and it's like that it doesn't feel like those should be on that. And this kind of idea of an armature is almost like a hunting gallery, or like, you know, it's this really violent material, like the metal itself, like in comparison to the other objects that are normally like placed on it. And I found that really like just really like intriguing. Like, are we just essentially like, are museums just hunting galleries? Are these just like the trophies that we've kind of carried? And why they kind of put them at like eyeline. So like a lot of these things, these objects that are like placed on these armatures, like are greeting you like directly in the face. And it's almost like, well, look, this is the history that our humanity has created. And you're kind of confronted with that. And I guess with the boat, like we spoke quite a lot, like with the fabricator who worked with Mark, who's amazing, and with the team at the Tetley, kind of spoke quite a lot about like where we should place that boat, because again, accessibility is like such a huge thing, and I didn't want it to be excluding people from being able to see it. But then at the same time, it was like, how do we actually make it stand in that room itself? Because if it was any lower, it's like we peer over it, then do we assert a power over these things that we look over it physically, or by lifting it and being able to peer in, it's like, are we actually allowed to do that? Like, should we do that? And does that link back into this idea of, should we be taking these objects out of the ground? Should we be owning them again? And then why do they become our property? And why aren't they sent back or given back or repatriated? And I guess I kind of wanted to think about that, but also like, I guess just, you know, in a basic sense as well, just aesthetically, like I think within that room, like as it kind of being halfway point in that space and in the middle, and kind of wanting to emulate like museum diorama sets as well. So like, you know, those kind of kids play areas where, you know, they're kind of these Viking thatched huts, and you're invited to go into them and, you know, cook something like a Viking, or like it'll be like an ancient Egypt display, and it's kind of like like the entrance to a pyramid. And I find that so interesting, this kind of recreation of these histories that, yeah, again, we're just kind of in some senses guessing. Of course, they're research as well. I'm not trying to, you know, not like be respectful to archaeology, but it's like, I just find that really intriguing. Yeah.
Can I take that one up? Because I think this whole thing that you steal things, and there's this whole other movement. I mean, I said we know that you know, the Greeks want the Elgin Marbles back, and this whole thing about reconstitution, returning objects, particularly taken from the living descendants of indigenous peoples, including, you know, sacred relics and bodies of their, you know, ancestors. This is such a huge issue in the world because it does come along to, you know, underlying this question of colonization, which assumed that everybody else's culture was dead to be collected. You know, and so when we have these kind of dioramas, you too can travel in time, you can feel what it was like, kind of counteracts this sense that these cultures are lost by thinking you can dress up and re-enter them, which defies the fact that there has been violence that left cultures less intact, that has taken from them the fabric of their own histories as the things that involved it. But I thought that one thing that made it not like a diorama was the bitumen, you know, was this sense that this was molded, this was not trying to pretend to be wonderful, it was just the physicality of it, etc. And then these little objects, we're looking at some now that within them are put in such a relationship of diversity of forms and textures, and they evoke animals that have lost their heads or things, and then you put the corn or the wheat into them. So you are keeping, you know, visually keeping you very, somebody's asking since, you know, very much in terms of their, in a sense, capacity to hold materially to their sense that they've been fabricated, but they look like something that is just been deteriorated from the past. So that kind of tension of time, but they're not giving me the sense that I could travel in time. I think that's what so struck me about the boat, the height. It was such a physical presence in its materiality. And then I'm sure, you know, San Bell'Infante or other people, you know, 6 foot friends of ours would look down and not have that thing. But that's again a very important thing because it genders the viewing space. It depends upon the body. And, you know, artists like Chantal Akerman, who always make films at the eyeliner of a person who's 5'2", because she was tired of having movies always made from somebody who's sort of 5'9" to 6 foot, right? Because, you know, the sort of phenomenology of the body is kind of interesting, etc. But I find these sort of the intimacy of these little objects so intriguing, and having looked into them and sort of felt, not that I was peering down, I quite agree, but something magical there. So it wasn't the diorama, it wasn't the reproduction, it was the kind of treasure trove of something, you know, that was still holding on to its sort of sacral elements. And that's what I'm still getting at, this sense of what do you think the, you know, the affect of your work is? Is it loss in the end? Or is it critique in the end? Or is it some pleasure that you use in the making to counter the narrative of loss and violation and death, as it were, and extraction and excavation, colonization? Something else there, which I think is what we need, you know, which is what makes them so haunting. And even in the context, as we're seeing now, the Tetleys, sort of this, you know, businessman's office with its fireplate, and you imagine the large leather desk and the, you know, the chairs and the environment of you know, 19th and 20th century commerce. And yet here are these presences occupying that space, using that wood, using that stone in a way that isn't just the effect of desolation. And so I think that's where, you know, since what you said about theatricality and faking and giving presence, I just want to talk a little bit more about what you feel the affect, the how should I be moved by what I see once I've worked out, as we've gone through these very deeply researched, these very strongly thought through issues of museums, excavation, colonization, the instance, the abuse of objects. Nonetheless, your work, because they're sculptures that have been made, have a different affect as well as a critical, you know, concept in a way. And I wonder, as we come to the sort of just the end of this conversation and open up for questions, if when you go around the exhibition, what is it that you take from once you've put them up, when you see it yourself? What does it leave you with that makes you think, I'm going to go to somewhere else now or develop something or something there was what I wanted or what wasn't what I wanted?
I guess it's like a mix of, kind of everything that you said, this kind of like examination of loss and collision and residue. But I guess also, kind of thinking about that museological critique at the same time. But I think for me, really, like, it's more about the reinterpretation of tradition and kind of how, I guess, like, to me personally, like, I don't know, I guess when people visit the show, they'll read from it what they will. But I think for me, it's about trying to figure out a way of how do I kind of deal with this history that I've inherited, that I'm lucky to have, and that is such a big part of me, and how do I reinterpret that for myself to make it something that then can grow, and that's something that then can be like added onto in the way that like I live my life, or like generations after me might. That draws on these like historic and really important personal histories, but also political histories of like the space that I like came from in many senses, even though I also didn't come from that space because I wasn't born there and have not lived there. But like I guess it's this kind of trying to make that history like moldable for myself, and like because of there's been these huge severings, like where do we then kind of pick up those new roots and where do we put them down? And I guess that kind of imagination of new forms or these objects that kind of touch on the past, and a past that is an ancient past as well, and how actually some of that can kind of feed into like the everyday of today as well, and like can almost create this like new mythology of a way of like understanding like a duality in some senses. But then I also guess that like I kind of I'm always really interested in that question of reinterpreting meaning of objects, and what those objects actually mean, like what is their true histories, and why don't we value that almost as much as the aesthetic of the object itself as well. So yeah, I guess that's sort of, how I kind of like interpret the work for myself in some senses, and it's something that I'm still like working out, and I think trying to constantly develop in terms of this obsession maybe with object, and how that is just such a vessel, a way of like being able to kind of decant and like outpour history at the same time together.
That sounds absolutely perfect. I love this sort of decanting and outpouring history together. And I think you just said this crucial thing about the sort of valuing objects purely for sort of appearances and aesthetics, as opposed to this combination of the sacral, the legendary, the mythic, the personal, the historical, and the material. I think it's time for us to open up to questions now. I see that we've had some questions come in, so I suspect Bryony will rejoin us instantly as she magically reappears to field the questions and allow other people to have a chance to speak. So thank you so much for letting me have the first go and this lovely conversation with Emii, and I'm longing to hear what other people want to ask and find from her as well.
Thanks, Griselda. Brian, I think you're muted.
Classic. Thank you so much, both of you. That was fantastic. It's great kind of listening in on your conversation. It feels, I think, in this context, even more like a private conversation between the two of you that we get to listen in on. So thank you both so much. So yeah, it's my fantastic job to kind of field some questions that we've had in. I'm actually going to start off with Laura's question. Laura Beer has asked, she says that love that there are objects in Emii's work that have been displayed in all her exhibitions. With this in mind, do each of her works build on the preceding ones? I think it's a fantastic story, Emii, when you were saying about those works that have been in shows that you've done since you graduated, and they've kind of come through time after time. I have this great vision of you kind of collecting work over your entire career and just having to kind of have bigger and bigger storage units to kind of facilitate it all. But yeah, so does each one kind of lead on to the next?
I guess in some senses, yeah. I mean, I think like I know definitely in terms of like titling work, like or like exhibitions, I'm really interested in this idea of chapter. And I think specifically from looking at like I have this amazing book which is Women's Writing from Mesopotamia, and it was about women who were scribing at that time and like writing cuneiform. And I found it was really interesting the way that they were titled, and each kind of title it just felt very like poetic, very like almost like a kind of linear story. So like Marshlands was my first like piece, and then it went to An Ancient Quiver, and then House of Teeming Cattle, and then Tutelaries, and then the High Dam. And I'm kind of interested in this kind of progression of works as this almost like a verse, or like a part of like a I guess like a myth in a sense.
Poem, epic poem.
Maybe, who knows? Maybe it'll just be a poem, maybe not epic, who knows? But like, I feel, I guess I'm always interested in like reusing the objects that I do have, just because of the scale of them in many senses. And I think that because so many of them are almost like plain, they're not plain, but they can act as like armature themselves. And I think thinking about what's in the studio and then how you can kind of reinterpret that like into like the next project, or like in terms of wanting to make bigger scale works. Like I think the reuse of things is always a really good way of feeding that into it, so it doesn't either eat up budget, or in terms of making work and storing it. But yeah, it's interesting. I feel like when especially those like big like stones, I'm always like, oh yeah, my babies. Hopefully they'll just last forever, but they are crumbling quite a bit. Obviously. Hopefully that answered your question, Laura.
Yeah, and I think there's I mean, it kind of actually follows on, I think, maybe possibly to another question, but I do really like the idea of those objects kind of gaining a history in their own right as well, I guess, in that way. That I think I remember you talking about some works that you installed at the Tetley that had a slightly different function in a previous show, and you kind of taken things off them and adapted them and changed them into something totally different at the Tetley. Yeah, kind of growing through each show. I'm going to actually return to, you mentioned Marshlands, which was the work that was in the Fuan Prize, and actually one of the other questions is from my co-judge on that prize, which was Derek Horton, and he said he wanted to ask Emii about the multi-sensory experience of her work. The installation that was in the Fuan Award show included sound, birdsong that related to the ecology of Iraq, as I recall. Is sound still something that might play a part in future installations?
Maybe. I feel like it's something that I would like to consider, but I think my skill at making sound work is very poor. But it's definitely like I have thought about maybe using sound in the future, and how that kind of activates a space. But at the same time, I feel with that piece, although I liked that there was this bird song that kind of worked with that specific work, I think in some senses I kind of like the silence that surrounds objects now, and in those spaces. And I think the way that almost emulates like a museological experience. You're supposed to be silent, you're supposed to, which I think is, you shouldn't be silent around those words, but I don't know. I think if I was to use sound, I think it would have to be linked to a very specific research part, or like a research project. With Marshlands, it was the Basra reed warbler, which was the bird that had been like hadn't been seen since the draining of those marshlands, and then when they were re-irrigated, it came back. So it made sense to kind of have this pull. But I think in the work that I've been making up to this point, I haven't really felt that there's any kind of sound that I could have used. Maybe I should have used like cow sounds for like House of Teeming Cattle, who knows?
Thanks, Emii. There's some really great questions coming in, so actually I'm just going to kind of carry on with some. I'm trying to kind of get them in some way that might make a bit of a sense in the flow, but maybe this kind of carries on. Susie is asking around actually how your work, how do you feel about being made available and experienced virtually? I guess kind of carrying on from that question around sound, obviously the show is currently closed, and so actually your only means of experiencing it is through the virtual images, and the images that we've just been showing. How do you feel about that, actually?
I don't know, it's a weird one, because I feel like maybe the part of like the enjoyment of like display is like with sculpture is kind of getting to like maybe even feel like the material of it and seeing that. But then I think we're just, you know, kind of heading into a time where things are going to be more virtual. So it's something that I'm kind of asking myself as well, and how I kind of would work in that sense. I don't know, because I feel I'm really crap at like any kind of, you know, like building things on virtually, and I don't know, it's After Effects that you use, or like the program where you can build things essentially, apart from The Sims, which I'm quite good at, but like yeah, I don't know. I feel like I would be open to it. I'd definitely be open to it, but I feel like would be interested in maybe working with people who would know how to facilitate that properly, or kind of translate the work digitally in a way that I think would still kind of evoke kind of sculptural sense. Because I think when I think of myself doing that, I'm like, it will be so bad because I don't know how to do it. But yeah, I don't know. I've been thinking about like how interpretation can work, and whether like poetry can kind of be added into that. But yeah, I guess I'm interested, if that answers the question. Yeah.
It's quite a challenge, I think, isn't it, for a sculptural practice, particularly in terms of yours, in that material sense, and that way of, you know, like Griselda's been, you know, talking about that moving around the space and the viewpoint and that kind of physical experience.
I guess also
to capture.
Maybe as well is something that like I think I'm quite interested in, like the experience of big scale things physically, and I don't know how well maybe that would be translated into a virtual environment. But it's not that I'm not like interested in trying it. I would be curious to see how that kind of developed.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's possibly kind of two questions here that I might kind of join together in some ways, which was a question from Kerry Harker and a question from Rebecca Wade, which was around how you're feeling about your objects being collected in themselves and what happens to them when they enter collections. And then Rebecca's also asking about the kind of near and far future conservation of your own objects. So in that sense, you know, are they ephemeral? Will they continue to be conserved by a collection one day? Have you thought about that at all in terms of how you think about your own work and its future?
I think that I'll answer Kerry's question first. Like, I think in terms of objects being collected themselves, I guess it's interesting, because I think for me, like, it's like this idea of like them kind of entering this other history, and like how they're kind of perceived in that space, and whether that becomes a domestic space or like a collection space. I guess because at the end of the day, they're also artworks. They're not artifacts. So I feel like there's this almost, even though like a lot of them like have such like personal identities like weaved into them, I still think there's a separation of like, you know, I've made like editions before for works to be collected or to be bought, and that I feel like is like, it's in some sense a source of income, which would you know, helps with like pushing forward like an artistic career. But then I don't know, I guess what happens to them when they enter collections is like, what I guess the thing is like, what will they next be like displayed next to? Like, do I have any agency over that, or do they just, you know, they become part of this collection and they enter this other narrative? And I'm kind of interested in them, like, do they die in some senses? Do they just kind of go through that whole museological like acquisition process? Yeah, hopefully that answers that. Yeah, I guess I think I'm more like, I feel yeah, because they are our objects, I think I feel okay about them going into collections, but yeah, depending on how they're displayed. And in terms of like the conservation of works, for Rebecca Wade's question, I don't know how they would be conserved really, because I'm quite interested in the decay of those objects. So one of the great joys of like, I find like making things is not being really precious about them, and actually the more they break and the more they kind of show signs of wear and tear, like the more interesting those are to me. So I think that I would almost kind of encourage that, and when they kind of reach their lifespan, like that's them. As I think also like in the case of like actual artifacts, some of them I'm like, maybe they weren't supposed to last this long, and maybe they were supposed to just, you know, decay into the world as they were. So I think, I don't know, because sometimes I'm like, with the conservation of those objects, by keeping them as pristine as they are, like I don't know whether they then get to live out their life cycle. So in some senses, yeah, I guess they're ephemeral, but then using materials that I think will last quite a while. Because like those pieces I've been using since 2016, and they're still kind of pretty sturdy. But yeah, I guess they could just reapplicate like plaster on them. They kind of have new coats of life.
Just on and on and on.
On and on and on.
Plaster.
Yeah, because I feel guilty about using polystyrene because it's terrible for the environment.
I guess if it continues to be used and kept in circulation, I think that's yeah, a slightly different way of than certainly like a kind of large theatrical installation that would be kind of totally dismantled. On theatricality, Sam Belafanti has a question, which was basically asking you to talk a bit more about theatricality. And he asks, what are your experiences other than art school that are feeding that?
So I did my study abroad here in Marseille, and I was lucky enough, one of my really good friends, Tom, his dad like worked in a set design, like it was like this amazing tent where they were sculpting things for theatres. And it was like one of the only times in my life where something like this has ever happened, where I remember I was about to leave Marseille and I was eating a kebab in a kebab shop. And my friend Tom bumped into him and I was like, oh, I'm leaving soon, blah, blah, blah. What are you doing for the summer? He was like, oh, I'm going to be working with my dad. We've got a couple of projects in Paris, and we're going to be like, yeah, working on them, and it's going to be really fun. And I was like, I'm so jealous. That sounds literally amazing. I'd love to do that. And he was like, yeah, well, you should come. You should come. And he asked his dad and his parents, well, his dad and his partner were unbelievable and let me stay with them for it was like 2 months, and I worked with them in Paris in set design, like in set building studio, and that's where I kind of got interested and like learnt and was taught about plaster manipulation and polystyrene. And I guess kind of when I kind of came back to uni after that year abroad, and again, like I'm extremely privileged to have had that situation, and for the kindness of Tom's family to let me stay with them, because otherwise I would not have been able to do that. And yeah, like I kind of really wanted to, I didn't really think about pursuing a career as an artist. I kind of was like, maybe I'd quite like to go into like set building as like a job. And then I just started like making works that kind of replicated like the work that I'd kind of been doing for the theatres in France. So yeah, that's kind of my experience of theatre and I guess stage building and how that's kind of influenced my work. Hope that answers the question, Sam.
Fascinating. Thank you. I mean, I think it's yeah, it's very. You were talking as well a little bit about the Pergamon, which I think is quite an astonishing museum in that kind of scale and its extreme theatricality. But yes, really interesting to hear about your experience. I didn't realise that you'd actually kind of had that experience actually directly working in theatre set design. Oliver Athadi asks a really interesting question, actually, and I'm interested to see your perspective on this, actually, Emii. He says, I'm half Persian myself, so I wanted to ask someone of a similar heritage. I feel like we don't really have any Middle Eastern representation in the media art world to a high degree. Do you feel we do?
Yes and no. Mainly no. I don't know, I feel like it's only been since kind of meeting people through different projects that I've met artists from similar backgrounds to me. So particularly working with the Arab British Centre, and I guess meeting amazing people through that, and yeah, then kind of like becoming more interested using social media and kind of finding other artists who are working as contemporary artists and making work. Like there are amazing artists who are making stuff, but I don't know whether there's enough artists from our heritage that are maybe like represented or are, I guess, in like major collections. I don't really know. I don't really know the answer to that. Mainly just because of my own ignorance and not actually knowing who's in what collection. But I do feel like I was having this conversation with my friend recently, and it's like I feel like it's only really this year or last year that I've kind of met other people from, you know, Iraq or like other parts of the Middle East, Iran as well, Egypt, like North Africa, and that's through social media and like seeing these artists like come together and like I guess kind of develop these projects. Like places like Habibi Collective are amazing, and they like showcase so much amazing work of artists, but I don't know whether those have been necessarily like they do amazing work and they do like amazing festivals, but I think there's other collectives like that might not have had a kind of the same opportunities as maybe other artists might have, and hopefully that's something that changes. But yeah, we should chat and we can like send each other artists. That would be nice. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, Griselda, yeah.
Can I just add something? There's just been a book published, edited by Ceren Opzinar, Opzinar, who's Turkish, a feminist art historian from Turkey, which has set up a network precisely because she says the sort of Near and Middle East is completely missing from particularly her area, sort of to do with particularly women and gender issues for the Middle East, which, as it were, literally from North Africa all the way around the Eastern Mediterranean and in further. So it's worth looking up because they've published, it's just been published by Bloomsbury. No, it is Bloomsbury, yes. And it's a wonderful new initiative. It may not help all artists, particularly if they're not women, but it certainly is trying to bring together a visibility for women working in that area. And it's Ceyren, Ceren, and then Opzinar is the book. But if you look on the Bloomsbury website, it's to do with, I'm sorry to say I can't remember the exact title at this late point in the evening. You just have to forgive me. But
that sounds really good. I'll definitely look that up.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt the questions. They're really fascinating.
Well, thank you for that, Griselda. I mean, yes, I think I can think of one Iranian artist off the top of my head, actually, and
but there's a huge community in Iran. There's a lot of women artists who both remained and come forward from that.
Yes,
I think, but also one has to. Obviously, the issues relate also to both sculpture, but also legacies of Islam. So a lot of the, for instance, interesting work that's coming out of Pakistan, which has a very large community of contemporary artists and contemporary women artists in Pakistan, but a lot of people are using various kinds of two-dimensional and non-representational forms to explore their issues, because obviously other kinds of representation are not, possible. So I think that it's also a different kind of, I mean, it's less problematic now, etc. But I'm just trying to think. Yeah.
Some really good questions, actually.
Lebanon.
Daniela Geraci, I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your surname correctly, has asked around the significance of storytelling. And is this the same horse that continues to feature in many forms within your work? The story of your horse on your grandfather's farm?
Yes and no. I think yeah, like that story definitely is something that like has always stuck with me because I found it really like magical, because I don't know whether it was like a story because I was told it when I was younger and stuff, and just feels like this this amazing horse that like only one guy from the farm could ride, and that horse had run away, and they like released it. They didn't want the horse anymore, and he'd keep coming back. And it's like, I don't know, it feels like this kind of myth. But I think with the kind of first exploration of horses that I did, it was more, I was actually interested in the material bitumen itself and like tar. And I was reading a lot about the early uses of tar and how it's like a byproduct of like tree felling, and they would kind of make this tar. Well, they would make tar, and then the horses would used to get their hooves like tarred, and that was a way to like stop infection coming into the horses. So I got really interested in like that material and its relationship to animals, and I think I'm quite interested in like the animal just generally, like outside of just horses, because I really love cows as well. Oh my god, cows, sweet cows. But I feel that there's something that, especially when we look at like collections from across the world, especially like early civilizations, like the use of animal imagery like in vessels, I think is so interesting, because there's quite a lot of the same imagery being used like in Greece, in like the Aztec period, in the Assyrian period, all over the world. And I think that animals are just such an interesting way of like conveying those stories and symbolism as well. And yeah, I just really like to draw on them, and yeah, I guess it's also just really nice looking at images of animals, because animals are sweet. But yeah, yeah, it is the same and it isn't the same at the same time.
Right, I'm going to just do one last question. I was going to ask Holly Granger's question, which is about how did you find working within the very particular surroundings, architecture of the Tetley? And how do you feel about how your artwork speaks to this context or is read in relation to it?
I feel like one of the main things I felt working in the Tetley, because you guys were amazing and let me work in the basement, was making a mess. And like that kind of, because obviously like the Tetley is like such a interesting building in the sense that, you know, it's got all this kind of like wood paneling, and it's very like luxe in many senses. And it's that thing of being like, I don't want to make a mess here, because this feels like, you know, it's like I don't know whether it is a listed building or not. Yeah, I don't know. It has this kind of feeling of like grandeur, especially like when you kind of go upstairs and there's like the boardrooms and you're sort of there, and there's the portraits. And I don't know. I think like I wanted to, specifically with like Gallery 9, I wanted to kind of play with the context of that room and that kind of wood paneling and that kind of almost like that imperial sense of some of the gallery spaces at the Tetley. And I guess kind of thinking about like the actions of people like during that period when imperialism was rife, and going and taking pieces of work or like these exotic objects and kind of bringing them back and then displaying them. And I kind of wanted to almost play with that and like have these objects that in Gallery 9 is almost like a quieter space than the Shirley Cooper where the boat is, and having these like more like detailed objects there, and kind of almost presenting them in a sense like a kind of like a cabinet of curiosity, even though I kind of not really a cabinet of curiosity at the same time. But yeah, I guess kind of like thinking about like the people who might have used that building at that time and like how they would maybe showcase those works, or like, you know, having them against this like very like luxurious and very like, you know, a space that kind of like is like an important space because of the materials that are used in the context. And I guess like it's history to like imperialism and colonization as well, because I think that the Tetley also had outputs in areas of which was like the colonized Commonwealth and factories. And I think, yeah, I guess I kind of wanted to display those works and kind of just work with that room in that sense, because there's no kind of removal of those panels, or there's not really a way that you can kind of escape it. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
I think that's fantastic. I think it's amazingly, well, a fantastic conversation. Thank you both so much. It's been really a massive pleasure listening to both of you and to the fantastic questions. Really great number of questions. I'm really sorry I'm going to have to draw this a little bit to a close, so we're running out of time. But I wanted just again to quickly thank those of you that supported the event and made donations. Thank you so much for your support. If you haven't made a donation and you still want to, you can visit the supporters page. I think the link is on our YouTube page. We'd also really appreciate any feedback from this event. This is our first artist conversation we've done online, and we've got more in the pipeline. So any feedback is very gratefully received, and you'll help us shape these conversations in the future. Again, you can find the link to our audience finder survey in the description as well. Finally, I really wanted to mention Panic, which is an incredibly exciting project that, as part of the Holberg Prize, Griselda has partnered with ourselves to establish a network for artists in the Leeds City region and to address the new conditions which face artists as an effect of the current crisis. So Panic will be establishing a network of emerging artists in the Leeds City region, and we'll be offering contact, mentoring and networking opportunities. And we'll be making £50,000 available to artists in bursaries to support the creation of new work that addresses the specific nature of the crisis. I'd really like to take this opportunity to publicly thank Griselda for her fantastic generosity in making this network happen. It's an amazing partnership to be working on, and it's great to be able to offer these opportunities for artists. We're currently asking for expressions of interests from emerging artists to join our steering group, and 6 artists will be able to join the group and will be paid £150 for each meeting, for a monthly meeting, for a period of just over a year. There's a link again for more information on this and how to join the steering group, so please have a look if you're interested, and please send us an expression of interest. We'd really like to hear from you. So it just leaves me to thank again both our speakers for a fantastic conversation. And also I'd like to thank my colleague, Georgia Taylor Aguilar, who's been behind the scenes making things happen. Thank you, Georgia. And I hope you'll be able to join us for our next artist talk. So thank you both, Emii, and thank you, Griselda. Fantastic evening.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and it's a delight to work with you and with Emii. Congratulations.
Thanks, Bryony. Thanks, Telly.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.